Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa bihi nasta'een wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammad wa alihi at-Tahirin. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad Rabbi antikna bil huda wa alhimna at-taqwa. Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I begin in the name of Allah, the most kind, the most merciful. It's due to that kindness and mercy that we have these opportunities where we gather to learn more about Him, Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So we're gathered this week and next week, inshallah, to look at the concept of marriage, especially from us living in this materialistic society. So we'll start with a little bit of an introduction on what we're going to be discussing. We all know that from an Islamic perspective that we have been created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not for this world, rather we have been created for the next world. We get a tradition from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam where he says, "Ma khuliqtum lil fana," that you have not been created to perish. "Bal khuliqtum lil baqa," rather you have been created to remain. "Wa innama tunqaluna min darin ila dar," but that you will only transfer from this realm to the next realm. So we have been created to reach that ultimate goal, the ultimate goal of akhirah. But to get there, we do have to traverse this world. We do have to cross this world, and therefore, we have to deal with the challenges that have been put forward in this world, or that which occur in this world. So we have to deal with the trials and tribulations. It's not that we are going towards akhirah and that we can just ignore everything that's happening around us. Rather, these challenges are going to give us our status in the hereafter if we are successful in passing them. So we have all forms of trials, right? We have poverty, sickness, war, many other things that come about, um, that come towards us. Not only that, we have to deal with other people in this world. And everyone has different emotions, everyone has different states that they are in. And even though I may be in a particular emotional or psychological state, there is no guarantee that everyone around me will be in that same state. And therefore, we have to constantly adjust ourselves and at the same time remain at that level or in that form that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to be. Part of the challenges of this world is that the world has a very strong gravitational pull towards it. Part of this pull is how attractive this world is and the pleasures that are associated with this world, which cause us to constantly chase after this world, right? There's no way for us to live in this world without having to deal with the attractions of this world or without having to deal with the temptations of this world. And so we see on one hand that we have all of these trials, especially the pull towards materialism in this world, and we clearly see that in our lives. We clearly see that around us. That one who has more is considered to be more valuable in this world. So the question is that how do we overcome this pull towards materialism, right? Um, and there's no magic pill. There's nothing that's going to make it a lot easier. Um, what it comes down to is following the teachings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whatever God has taught us, whatever the Prophet came and taught us, whatever the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam taught us, these are the things that are going to allow me to successfully navigate this world, especially the pull of materialism in this world, to be successful so that I can cross over to the hereafter with as few blemishes as possible. So some of the recommendations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us is, for example, to cut out false expectations, right? The world is very good, and we don't want to blame the world. It's the people of the world who does this, but dunya has this attraction um, where it makes us satisfied with the temporary results that we see in this world rather than waiting for the results in the hereafter. And so when I do something and I see a result immediately, that makes me more inclined towards chasing other material things because they give me results immediately. So that's false expectations, or what's known as tulul amal. But one of the ways in which we can pull ourselves off from this materialism is by cutting out false expectations, not being satisfied with worldly results, but rather looking for results in the hereafter. Other things would be to be satisfied. God constantly tells us to have satisfaction with whatever we have, to be grateful with whatever we have. One of the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala recommends highly, as we know, is marriage, right? And again, like, we have to look at it from this lens that everything that God tells us to do in this world, whether it is obligatory or whether it is recommended, the results would be for us to successfully traverse this world so that we can get to the hereafter successfully. And marriage is one of these points where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala highly, highly recommends marriage, to that extent where we know traditions that tell us there is nothing more beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the institution of marriage. And so marriage as well would allow us to detach ourselves from materialism so that we can be successful in the hereafter. And how does it do that, right? So we're going to be looking at some of the philosophies of marriage in this particular discussion so that we can understand how the concept of marriage and the effect that marriage should have actually works towards detaching us from this materialistic world. And then we're going to look at the steps that one should take to ensure that they strengthen their marriage so that this goal of detaching ourselves from materialism is accomplished. So it's a two-step process that we're going to be looking at today and next week. So we begin with looking at some of the philosophies of marriage. Now, one of the first philosophies of marriage is love and companionship, right? All human beings need to feel loved, to feel connected with others. We need to feel that there's someone there for us, to share our joys and sorrows with, and to be a companion and someone we can depend on. Now, there is no doubt that the love and companionship that is found within a marriage cannot be duplicated, um, because it's a choice we're making, right? And when it comes to the relationship of siblings or with parents, we're from the day we're born, we have this internal love for them. But when you meet someone and you're willing to sacrifice yourselves for them, the love and companionship that is grown from that relationship is almost unduplicated. And so, if we understand that, right, that if that love and companionship is nurtured or handled properly, um, we will feel a sense of completeness in our life. And if we have that love and companionship within our homes, then we don't need other things outside to make us feel like we are complete. Thus, we don't need materialistic things, right? Um, if I feel like there is something lacking in my own life, then I will look towards other things. I will look towards other people. I will look towards my job. I will look towards my possessions to try to make me complete. But if a person has love in their house and love in their relationships, it doesn't matter then if they don't have much else, because they feel complete because of what is there. So again, from this philosophy of love and companionship, we can see how, if it is nurtured correctly, it can make us feel whole where we don't need anything else to make us feel whole. So that's one philosophy of marriage that ties into our discussion. The second reason, or the second philosophy that is often given by scholars, is that marriage allows us to fulfill our desires legally, right? There is no doubt that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed the instinct of physical desires in the human being, and celibacy is never encouraged in Islam. And so when we have this system that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has allowed for us to fulfill our desires, then I don't need to look anywhere else to fulfill my desires, right? So if both parties within the marriage, with both spouses within the marriage, if they realize that it's their job to fulfill the desires of each other, then we don't need to look outside of our marriage to help us fulfill that. And therefore, we are, again, not looking outwards towards making us happy. Rather, we are looking inwards within our own lives to make us happy. And again, that's another example of how we need each other to save us from the outside dangers that exist. Another philosophy that is mentioned is the spiritual benefit, right? Sometimes in life, especially when it comes to that which we cannot see, God we cannot see. Um, Sometimes we need extra motivation to be able to connect to that unseen, especially when it comes to the promise of rewards in the hereafter. It takes a lot of faith to believe in that. It means you are willing to sacrifice certain things now for a promise of something that you're not going to materialistically see in this world, and that drive to get to that place. um, Sometimes we need encouragement. We need someone to push us and to motivate us, and marriage allows that, right? Especially when both parties, I keep saying parties, but you understand. But when both spouses um, are God consciously driven, where they realize that that's the ultimate goal, it can tremendously help us in our spiritual progression, right? And when we have that level of contentment at home, where the person next to me drives me towards that, then there's no need to worry ourselves with outside temptations, right? That's giving us more time to grow ourselves because I have everything at home. I realize that my spouse will push me towards the right way and keep me away from the things that I know are harmful for me spiritually. And so again, marriage allows us to confine ourselves and find our all basically within our partners. The next philosophy of marriage that is given is the maturing of personality. Um, this is again something very interesting, right? That Shahid Mutahari discusses this in some detail as well in his book Education and Training in Islam, when he says that there is nothing like marriage to lead someone to become mature in their personality. And that's because we are created to be social beings and not isolationist beings. And when we live with other people, that's when we get to know the true worth of ourselves, right? Like if I spend a few hours at mosque with you, or if I, for example, spend some days with my employees or my colleagues at work, there's generally a facade there of who I truly am. But when you come home, that's who you really are. And so marriage will allow us to see if we are selfish, if we are kind, if we're compassionate, or we're angry all the time. And when we realize that we are responsible for each other, it allows us to mature and become these selfless beings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to be, where we look out for each other. So, what helps us overcome these temptations is when we mature and we're not childlike, where we're chasing all of these things. So, that maturity that comes from marriage will also make me realize that I don't need everything around me to become full. Rather, I have everything within my partner and within my own being. So from these points, right, that are mentioned here, and again, there are so many other philosophies of marriage, but I think this highlights the points really well in the sense that everything that marriage has to offer, it helps us towards detaching ourselves from false pleasures and finding that satisfaction within ourselves so that we can work tirelessly towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, naturally, these things don't come about just by magic, right? Um, we have to work really hard to gain these benefits and to be able to find that satisfaction within ourselves. And we'll talk about this in the course of this lecture and next week, inshallah, but we need both parties um, to pull their weight. And if one spouse is moving forward and the other spouse is not willing, then that relationship will not gain satisfaction. If one spouse is pulling the other one down, that won't gain satisfaction. If one is moving too quickly and not compassionate to allow the other one to catch up, you won't gain satisfaction. And this is where both spouses really need to have conversations with one another, create a plan with one another, so that they can fully achieve the goals of marriage, which will allow them then to be detached from everything that will make our akhirah not as pleasurable as it can be. This is the um, this is like the rule of God, in the sense that nothing is given to one except if they strive for it. One of my favorite verses in Surah number 53, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verses 939 and 40, He says, وَأَن لَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى. And nothing belongs to a human being except for what they strive for. وَأَنَّ سَعْيَهُ سَوْفَ يُرَى. And whatever they strive for will soon be shown to them. Sometimes there's this notion that I think it's just the way we're brought up sometimes, is that, when you're young, you're told, okay, you need to get to do good in school. So you do good in school. And then you're told you need to graduate university, and then you do. And then you're told you need to get a job, and then you do. And then you're told you need to get married, and you do. And it's almost like, okay, I've checked it off. Now that I've checked it off, that means I'm done with it. But marriage isn't like that. You know what I mean? Marriage is not just a checkbox. Marriage, now that you've done it, that's when the actual um, striving has to kick in. It's not the marriage that is the big deal. Just like our faith, it's not a big deal, honestly, that we're Muslim. It's not a big deal that we're Shia. We were born this way, you know what I mean? Most of us. But rather, what is a big deal is, now what do I do with that faith? And likewise, when it comes to marriage, now what do I do with that marriage to allow me to grow in this way? So we're going to be looking at three main things in this course of this discussion. Today, we're going to discuss the first two, inshallah. And then the next one is the longer discussion that we'll wait until next week if we are still alive, inshallah. So, the first responsibility that we have to create a healthy marriage, again, stay with me when it comes to why we're talking about these. So, these things will help us have a good marriage, a healthy marriage, which will help us achieve the goals of marriage, which will help us stay away from those things which will make our akhirah bad for us, right? So, that's how the collective chain is going. So, the first thing that um, we need to work on, and both this is individually and then collectively in our relationships and then within our families, is God consciousness and piety, taqwa and bir, basically, right? Like where um, the boundaries that God has set into play or set for us have to be observed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah 66, verse number 6, He says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu qu anfusakum wa ahlikum nara. That, O you who believe, save yourselves and your families from the hellfire. This is our jobs, right? So when Allah says that, obviously, if I'm saving others from the hellfire, I have to be one who is saved from that as well. So we have to, in our relationships, realize that there are certain boundaries that cannot be crossed within our houses, and both spouses and the family needs to respect that. Now the family will respect that, like we're talking about children, when they see the parents respect that, right? I gave this story. I'm not sure if you heard it, but this happened to me recently, where I got an email from someone saying that, like, he has a sister who's 16, and her parents, she wanted to go to her friend's sweet 16 party or something, a Shia girl. But her parents said no to her because there was going to be boys and music at that party. And so this guy, he was a 21-year-old young man. He said to me, like, she's really like upset about this, and so can you give us advice on how to help her? And The only thing I could think of at this time was that the only way she'll truly overcome this, like this is a temporary like sadness she's feeling, right? That's not a big deal. But the way she overcomes it as a whole when she sees consistency, right? Um, where, for example, I told him that if you are invited to someone's 21st birthday party, your parents will also say no to you, right? Because they said no to her. It's not just because she's a girl or she's young, but these are boundaries that are set by God. And likewise, if your parents are invited to someone's wedding, they would say no because there's going to be music there, for example, or a mixed gathering. When that level of consistency is seen, that is when the family will realize that these are our boundaries and we do not cross these boundaries. There have to be boundaries. And these boundaries within our marriage cannot be arbitrary. They are set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, what that means is that we don't allow haram things in our house, right? If something is haram, we don't allow it. So my kids don't see me bring something haram into this house. Um, my spouse doesn't see me bring something haram in this house, and my spouse doesn't bring something haram in this house. We don't watch haram things in this house. We observe the time of prayers in this house. So when the time of salah comes in, we turn whatever it is that we're doing off, right? If we're playing a game with our family, we stop that. If we're watching TV as a family, we stop that. It doesn't matter if the Leafs are playing in the playoffs or the Raptors are playing or whatever it is. When it's time for salah, it's time for salah. And because we are keeping this a God centric house, right? And we keep our promises. And so if I tell you I'm going to do something, I'm going to do something because Allah expects us to keep our promises. Now, again, this is really important, right? Like in all of these things, and again, we can go into so many different examples, but in all of these things, if one party is lazy or not observant of it, it will have a negative effect on the relationship. And most likely, the one who is weaker in faith will pull the other one down because faith is very delicate, right? It's in only very limited circumstances where the one who's strong in faith will lift up the one who's weak in faith. But the one who's weak in faith will either bring the other person down, or because of their non-willingness to budge, you'll find that they will fracture that relationship, and that's when you begin to see a lot of problems. So this is the first and the most important thing that I think, before one gets married, they need to have this conversation and say, look, are we willing to live by these boundaries, these statuses, these orders that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us? And if that conversation is not there, we need to have that conversation now, because if we're not going to put God first, God is not going to put us first. And so this is, I think, one of the most important things. Now, naturally, this is the ideal system, and um, I don't want to say it's rare. Inshallah, it's not rare. But one of the other things that comes about of this is that, what if my spouse is not living up to the end of their bargain, right? So this is something that um, we have to look to see. There's certain processes that we need to go through to see what we can do. So the first thing is that I need to, okay, let's say um, I want to do X. And this has to do with God, obviously, right? But I want to do X, and my spouse is not willing to do that. So the first thing is that I need to check to see if my conduct and expectations are within normal limits, right? So if I'm telling my spouse that we shouldn't listen to music in the house, that would be within the boundaries of acceptability, as far as um, like it's something that can be expected, right? Because it's a clear haram line, right? I don't like my spouse smoking marijuana, for example. That's a clearly legitimate expectation that is there. Um, but for example, like if I want to recite Salatul Layl every night and I want my spouse to kind of help me with that, um, I have to kind of look to see if whether or not my expectations are are legitimate, right? So for example, like if we have a baby in the house and the baby keeps waking up every 2 3 hours, I really can't expect my wife then, who's finally fallen asleep, to be like, "Hey, you got to pray Salatul Layl." That's not an expectation that is necessarily um, reasonable. You know what I mean? Because I don't think even God would be like, "Hey, you didn't do that." God recognizes these things. We have to look at how reasonable God is with us, right? And then we have to try to see whether that reasonable expectation kind of comes into that, right? So we have to be reasonable in our expectations. If I want to fast Monday and Thursday, but my husband works like a lot of late hours or whatever, I can't expect him to be able to religiously do that the way I want to. So you have to make sure that the expectations that you have are reasonable. Haram and halal cannot be compromised when it comes to that, right? So for example, again, like let's say my spouse smokes weed, but then their justification is, look, I'm really stressed at work. That's not a reasonable expectation. There are other ways we can relieve that stress. You understand? So number one is we need to make sure that our conduct and expectations are within normal limits. Number two is we need to show through our actions what we would like to see in each other. So for example, if my spouse watches inappropriate scenes and movies, um, then I don't join my spouse for those movies, right? And I make it known that this is something without being, um, I don't know, without being, we never need to be rude about it, but we need to make it known that our displeasure is there, that this is going on. But I need to show through those actions what we would like to see in our spouse. So basically, do what you want, not just say what you want, right? So let your spouse see these things. If you want to recite extra nawafil, you pray the extra nawafil, and inshallah at the same time, um, that inspiration may kick in. But it's really important that you do it. Now, obviously, if the spouse is not willing to join in with you in these things, it may take an effect on you. But that's where your own faith needs to a little bit buck up a little bit and strengthen up to say that I'm going to continue with these things. The third is that, try and reason with them without completely like guilting them. We don't want to nag, you know what I mean? But try and reason with them on how this is affecting your spirituality and that of the children, for example, if the children are in play. So, if, for example, if your spouse watches TV at the time of Salah, you can kind of show them that, look, um, this is our children now are hesitating to pray, for example, or the sound of the TV is disturbing me. Do you mind just turning it off for a few minutes and let's go pray together? We're really hopeful um, that there is no serious incompatibility when it comes to God consciousness and piety within a marriage, because that should have been sorted out before marriage, especially if we got married for the right reasons, right? So we didn't get married for money, or we didn't get money for looks, or we didn't get married for whatever other reason, but we got married because we got to know each other. We saw that there was compatibility religiously as well, with as for and other things. Then there shouldn't be such a major disconnect when it comes to God consciousness and piety within a marriage. Now, sometimes what may happen, and I've seen this happen all the time, a lot of times, is that they entered the marriage with that same goal of God consciousness and piety, and in certain instances, one of them had a major had some type of break, right? Whether it is psychological break, spiritual break, emotional break, something happened that caused them to regress to now where you need the other spouse to lift them up. And this is where you would see that some of these things would come into play. So you would kind of remind them and say that, look, we used to do these things. We were so happy. Let's try and do these things. And then, of course, we need to pray, right? We need to pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help guide our spouse. And then, if these things are not working for a certain period of time, then we need to seek counseling. Because if God is not central in our lives, then nothing else that we do is going to work, basically, right? So we need to make sure that God is central in our lives. So these are just some of the tips that, again, like our ulama give us, and marriage experts give as far as what we can do, especially we're looking at it from an Islamic perspective. So God consciousness and piety is a standard that all of us need to live by, that will help create a healthy marriage. The second point is love and affection. Um, Love is the most important ingredient of a happy marriage. Without it, life, without love and affection, really, life um, becomes a bit dreary, and marital duties become burdensome. So when there is love and affection, and it's not just all about physical intimacy, but it's I feel appreciated, I have this love in my heart, my spouse, then that's when all of the recommended acts of marriage become quite pleasant to do. When you look at marriage, right, there are certain things which are the husband's responsibility, and then there are certain things that are the wife's responsibility. But if we just look at those areas of obligation, they're very limited, right? She's not expected to cook. He's not expected to take them on vacations, whatever it is, and however the gender roles you'd like to take those examples in, right? Um, but when there's love in this marriage, then all of these recommended things begin to come naturally, and they actually are exciting to do. But when that love is gone, that's when you'll begin to see a lot of bitterness in that marriage. Like, I don't want to hang out with you. I don't want to do these things for you. And that takes a great toll on the marriage. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, he describes this. He says, وَكُلُّ قَرَابَةٍ يَحْتَاجُ إِلَى مَوَدَّةٍ. He says that every relationship needs affection, needs love. And again, it ties back to our earlier discussion as well. Like, if you take a child even, who has been given all of the material pleasures of this world, yet there is no love in their house, that child is going to grow up broken. But if you take another child who may not have those riches around them, but they grew up in a house where there was love, that child's going to blossom. And the same thing applies to marriages. Now, and a really important point, and this could be like a separate discussion on its own, that don't expect the same manifestation of love and affection from your spouse that you give to them. There's this whole discussion on the language of love. It's quite interesting, right? And they say that there are different, 4 or 5 different languages of love. Some people feel loved when they're touched. Others feel loved when they're given something like a gift. Others feel loved when there is just like care and concern. So there are different languages of love, and it could well be that your spouse and you don't speak the same language of love. And so part of the challenge of marriage really is to learn each other's language of love and appreciate their language, but at the same time try to speak their language. So it's a double sword here, right? Not in a negative way. um, so if your spouse, for example, likes, so if you have to learn to see the language that your spouse speaks, and for your spouse, if they don't really need material things to make them feel like they're loved, but all they need is just appreciation, and they need just um, pleasantness, right? Like care and compassion. Um, then when that spouse of yours, instead of buying you a gift which you really like, just shows you appreciation and compliments your dinner, for example, and compliments your outfit, for example, you should appreciate that that's their way of demonstrating love. But what begins to happen often is that when the language is not understood, the complaint that will come is that he doesn't take care of me or she doesn't appreciate me, when you don't realize that the language of love was different to begin with. But on top of that, right, we need to learn to speak each other's language of love. And that's really where the maturity that we talked about in the previous slides takes into play, where I'm not just going to stick to my language and say, but this is how I say I love you and this is how I'm going to do it. No, we got to look at how our spouse does it and see what makes them happy, right? Like, if, for example, when you bought your wife something or when you bought your husband something, and if that was their language and you saw how much they glowed and how much they shined from that, then you need to start imitating that and mimicking that more often to be able to show that language. So I think this is a really important point. and it may require like a sit down, right? Like to say that, okay, what do you like? And generally we should know by now what that would be, so that we can go above and beyond our way to do that. Now, um, some of the ways in which we can demonstrate this love and affection. Number one, is we need to be pleasant in character. So what does that mean, right? It means like I smile more in the house. Like I'm not just like this grumpy dude, who's just grunting his way through the day, but rather like I'm displaying some akhlaq. I'm not rude. Imam Ali alayhi salam, again, he says sababul muhabba al bishr. He says that the cause of love is cheerfulness. That means when we come into the house um, with a pleasant demeanor, it softens up the house. What's interesting is I read an article recently that also said that the first 30 minutes of your day, the temperament you have in the first 30 minutes of your day will determine your entire day and the temperament throughout the day. So if we wake up um, cheerful and not angry at my kid who's not getting ready fast enough or whatever it is, um, then that will set the mood for the entire day, right? And especially with spouses, that if your spouse sees you happy, then they will be happy. You know what I mean? And likewise, um, what often happens, and I'm sure we can all attest to this, is that when we are outside, we are different people than when we are in our houses. So the whole day, maybe I'm putting up a facade when I'm around people all day and I'm smiling all the time, and really I'm just tired of it now, right? And I just want to kind of just relax at home. We have to keep in mind that our family has been kind of waiting for us. Our family, um, they will, our mood affects the mood of our family, right? And so one of the things that we have to do all the time, whether, for example, if you're stay at home or whether you're working or you go out for whatever it is, we have to find ways to make sure that we don't bring our stress home with us. And this is not easy to do. For example, like if I'm just tired from work, I just get into the car and I just drive home, and I'm stuck in traffic, and that just adds to my frustration. And then I come home and that frustration kind of just spills out. I have to find ways to declutter myself or de-stress myself before I come home. So we need to learn to decompress before we come home. So there are simple things, and again, like we can Google these things and find these things. But for example, just taking a 10 to 15 minute walk to cool off, right? Um, so whether it is right after you get out of work, or for example, you park your car in your driveway, just take a quick stroll, quick relaxation, so you can kind of just unwind a little bit, so that when you come home, that tension is not being carried with you. That realization that your spouse has gone through their own stresses that day. One of the important ways in which we can get over the trials and tribulations of this world is the recognition that everyone is going through trials and tribulations. It's not just me. So I don't need to feel so sorry for myself. So when we realize that, and we accept that, we come home with a care and concern not only about my own burdens, but about the burdens and difficulties that my spouse had to endure today. And imagine, like, if you have both spouses who do that. So it's not about me, it's about you. Hey, how was your day? Everything okay? What did you do today? These things automatically melt and thaw away the ice and the frustration that has been building over the day. So we need to learn ways of decluttering ourselves, decompressing ourselves, so that we're constantly have pleasantness in how we deal with each other. So being pleasant is really important. Um, if, for example, I wake up grumpy all the time, um, it means like I'm not getting proper rest at night. It means probably I'm sleeping late at night. It probably means that um, I'm watching too much TV at night. And so I got to trace back what are the causes of my lack of good character so that I can get to its source and try to eliminate its source, right? So that's number one, is that how to create love and affection is we need to work on ourselves to be pleasant. What we'll talk about next week is about communication and how to, and arguments and how to solve arguments and how to argue correctly, and acceptable and in an acceptable manner. And we'll touch upon this point next week. Is that um, okay? We'll just leave it for that point. But again, I think one of the points here about the pleasantness of character is that I can't control how my child is going to be today. I can't control how my spouse is going to be today, but I can control myself. And so if I'm working towards being pleasant in character and my wife sees that, my spouse sees that, that should also inspire them to be pleasant in character and work towards them. Especially again, like I don't feel that um, we have spouses who don't care. We have spouses who care, but they kind of feed off our emotions. If we both take that responsibility to tighten up our own relation, to tighten up our own akhlaq, that will rub off in a positive way because our spouse has that concern and love for us, right? So number one is be pleasant in character. Number two is pay attention to your spouse. Again, like this is like obvious, right? But it's something that um, doesn't seem to be that obvious sometimes, right? Like if I come back from work and I come home at like 6, and then we have dinner together, and then we just rushing to put our kids to bed, for example, or I have class or I have something, and by the time we actually have time for each other, I just want to kind of sit back and watch Netflix. Right? I don't want to talk, you know. But we have to make sure that we find ways of displaying our attention to our spouse. It doesn't mean you can't watch Netflix, um, but there are other ways to make our spouse feel like we are connected to them. Right. So, for example, we need to respect their feelings, and their opinions, and even their desires. Um, don't be dismissive of them. You may not agree with your spouse's outlook on a particular issue, but that is their outlook on that particular issue. Now, you can speak to them to try to show them another possibility, but just to say, that's ridiculous, that would undermine their emotion. And we have no right to undermine someone's emotion. We can try to learn about that emotion, and we can try to learn what are the causes of that emotion, but we have no right to just dismiss that emotion, right? So we need to learn to respect their feelings, and little statements like, "Look, I believe that this is what you're saying, and then this is what you feel, but have you thought of this, for example, right? What do you think about this, for example?" Um, and have a conversation, right? So respecting each other goes a long way to making both spouses feel like they are partners rather than creating a system within the house or a tier within the house where one feels submissive to the other. When we look at it from the perspective of wilaya, that's something different. We're just talking about in our house, we're partners. You know, yes, the husband has been given a certain wilaya or authority, um, but when that authority is given, it means that they are people who respect everyone else, and they respect opinions, and they work towards and have a shura, a council of reaching a particular decision. So respect is crucial. Listening attentively, right? Again, this is like really hard. Um, where like eye contact is important. So it's not just that I'm on my phone and I'm like, yeah, yeah, yeah. It doesn't excuse me, it um, doesn't bring about happiness. You know what I mean? Or if I'm watching a game and I'm just like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And again, like I think it goes both ways too. You know what I mean? So, for example, and again, I think this does come up in communication, is that we have to pick the right time to have a discussion. And we have to give opportunities for the right time for discussion. So it's not like always like every night I'm watching the game and you can't talk to me. Um, but certain nights, for example, if I'm saying like, hey, look, this is like a really important game, do you mind if I watch it? Then at that time, the spouse should know that, okay, this is, let me just give them the space. But other times when, because it's my routine to watch, that's not justification to not be able to give them attention. Um, helping is crucial, right? And I think both spouses can be able to help each other. But often, if one spouse is home, that doesn't mean that the one who is outside working doesn't do anything in the house. And if both spouses are working outside, that means that responsibility inside the house is obviously for both parties, right? For both spouses in that level. So helping in whichever way that we can. You know, sometimes just like the simple thing of like, man, looks like you had a rough day. How about I just bring dinner home, for example? That goes a long way rather than just expecting something from your spouse. So certain gestures to show that you're showing concern adds a lot of it fills our tank of love. You know what I mean? Like I appreciate you doing that, and that in itself creates this muhabba, this love and affection that actually will allow us then to overlook certain things which are also bothering us, but we can see that love. But if that love is never displayed, or if it's not done often enough, then those crickets in the back begin to get louder and louder. You know, and when those crickets get loud, then everything doesn't. Then nothing kind of replaces that noise anymore. So other things that we can do, for example, is sharing interests and ideas, sharing successes and failures. We have to create a partnership within the house, with our spouses, where we are sharing things. But again, like it goes both ways, right? So it's not just about me sharing, but it's also me knowing and feeling comfortable that I'm not going to be judged when I share. And that does come up in communication about not judging and how to listen attentively and things like that. But again, these are just some examples of how we can pay attention to our spouse, which will add to the love and affection. um, Another area of how to demonstrate love and affection is by overlooking mistakes and forgiving, right? Um, like no one is perfect, right? Um, Honestly, no one is perfect. And the more time you spend with someone, the more you will notice mistakes, right? You will notice things that bug you. You will notice things that annoy you. Um, but it's important that we can again like overlook certain things. And I think like one of the great criteria is, again, we go back to our first point, is of God consciousness, right? Where it's a God centric house. um, so um, if it's not something that is violating God's law, then I gotta really look to see like how many times do I gotta bring this up again and again, right? It's not. It's important to not over enforce mistakes and constantly bring them up. If the spouse has said I'm sorry, and they are regretful for what they have done, it's important not to constantly nag and criticize them and to remind them. Um, God doesn't do this. We need to make sure that we kind of have that as well. So certain things we don't ever need to even bring up. You know what I mean? And I need to kind of check myself on that. Other things which, for example, hurt me, I need to bring up and have a discussion about it. But once we talk about it, if I feel like it's been resolved, I don't bring it up again. But then if it's something that is violating the boundaries of God, then I need to talk about it and we need to make sure that it doesn't infringe or doesn't come again. Another aspect that brings about love and affection is protecting the faults and shortcomings of each other. There's nothing to there's no, I think one of the best examples of love and affection is when you're willing to take um, the bullet for your spouse. You know what I mean? And this could be for your with your in-laws, your friends, even your children. Like, hey, it's not her fault. I kind of made a mistake, or you know what I mean? Like that will show that you're concerned about them, and that will show that your primary, um, I don't want to say happiness, but your primary objective is their happiness. And that's a beautiful way to live, right? So we're not saying we're lying or anything like that, but we're just protecting each other's faults. Like I'm not going to go and complain to my mother about what my wife is doing. No, that stays in house, man. You got to figure that out. Um, if your wife is not comfortable, for example, going somewhere, um, it's okay for you to say, you know what, like I can't come today. You be the bad person with your friends, but if your wife's is not comfortable, you need to respect that. We're not saying lying, right, as such, but there is this concept of tawriya, of not speaking necessarily the full truth, but in these instances when we're saving the honor of our wife, of our spouse, it goes a long way to create this love and affection. And obviously, the last thing that we'll talk about today is physical intimacy, right? Where Allah, as we mentioned, has created this need within us. We need to make sure that both spouses um, are doing their part to fulfill um, their spouse's needs, and it has to be, again, if there is love and affection, this will come about very naturally, right? But if there isn't, there's going to be resentment, and this is where it's going to add a lot of pressure within that marriage. The simple things, right, like look nice for each other. So like because you were off from work for a week doesn't mean you don't shave for a whole week when you would have shaved if you had gone to work. Look nice for your spouse, right? Do something romantic for each other. Again, like I don't know, whatever the language of love that your spouse speaks, that's the language that you need to speak. So these are again just some very simple points about things that we can do to add love and affection. Because again, if a house doesn't, a relationship doesn't have this, is going to be a bitter filled relationship, right? And it's going to create a lot of resentment that will not allow that marriage to be healthy and thriving, which will then cause us to be looking elsewhere, to be quite honest, for that which is missing. It's not always in another person, right? But it could be in something material, something that will make me feel like it's complete when my spouse and I should have that completeness within us. So we'll stop here. The next week's discussion is all about communication and effective communication and what we can do, how to effectively communicate, the art of listening, the art of argument, of resolving conflict, and then inshallah that will give us a good start, you know what I mean, of how we can um, create this healthy marriage. So we'll stop here. Um, if there are any questions, I guess there's a chat that's open. We have a few minutes if anybody wants to ask something, otherwise, we can end it, inshallah. Yeah, so that we'll let admin deal with that. So if admin is okay starting at 8:45, I'm okay with starting at 8:45. We'll let the Academy reply back. That's an email, inshallah. Okay, perfect. Academy's replied. Another minute if there's any questions. Did I say that it has to only be something that goes against Allah? No, that's not what I said. Um, if it's something that hurts me, right, I absolutely have to bring it up. But when I bring it up and when we reach a particular conclusion on it, I shouldn't then bring it up all the time. Like, hey, but you remember you did this, remember you said this, unless it comes constantly comes up again. So if it's something that hurts me, absolutely, I can't just keep it inside, right? But I have to. But it's not something that needs to constantly be brought up. But if it's something that is violating the laws of Allah, um, then I need to make sure that that is resolved in the ways that we described earlier. What are some examples of the mutually trusted third parties that we can seek guidance from? Um, so I would start with family, right? But I would make sure that the family members that I'm picking are someone who is trusted by both sides. So it's not someone, for example, like I pick my mom and my wife doesn't feel comfortable addressing or talking about these things in front of my mom. It's not going to be an effective third party counseling. But I would find someone that both of us are comfortable with to then talk about it. I would also try to make sure that the person that I'm speaking to um, has at least some Islamic knowledge so that they don't guide me culturally, they don't guide me secularly, but they're guiding me from the Islamic perspective. If, and obviously, like uh, someone from the community, a scholar, or some social worker from the community, that would be an ideal circumstance. But again, the most important thing from what I um, understand or from what I see, that has to be someone that both sides feel comfortable with. When that comfort is there, then we'll be willing to accept what they say. So we'll end here, inshallah. And if there's okay, when you say to declutter, it is sometimes hard to do, especially if you work late and are looking forward to come home. I agree. Anything good is hard. Anything good requires a lot of effort. You know, yeah. To have a good marriage and to have a happy house requires a lot of effort. Um, and so you need to maybe, uh, yeah, I don't know. I don't have an easy answer for you, but nothing is easy. Nothing good, nothing that's really worthwhile is easy. And so finding or inconveniencing myself for just a little bit to have a greater happiness, that's what we do for Jannah. Um, that's what we need to do for our house. So whether, for example, it's just taking a quick 5 minute, or I know it's hard to do in Toronto or somewhere else, but like open the window and drive, let that fresh air come in, something that will allow you just to kind of declutter a little bit. Maybe it's reading 2 minutes of Quran in the car, just so that when we come in, we actually have a smile on our face rather than this grumpiness of a hard day, of a hard day. You know what I mean? Um, Again, like it's not easy. I don't know. This whole thing, if you look at it, it's not easy. Some couples allow each other the space and freedom to practice the religion the way they want to. What do you have to say about this? Um, like, are we talking about haram and halal? That there's like we should never like be like, okay, you can do something haram. You know what I mean? But if we're talking about like different levels of istihbab or recommendations, because one party doesn't have that interest or can't keep up. Um, okay, so you are talking about haram and halal, wajib and haram. Um, that example that you're giving about hijab, that should have been like sorted out before marriage. You know what I'm saying? Like, so now that they've entered marriage, and if he's resentful about her not wearing hijab, um, that's his bad, to be quite honest, for even getting married in the first place. But if he doesn't care and she doesn't care, then they're right where they are for each other. You know what I mean? As far as the religious boundaries are concerned, is it allowed and it is common for married men to practice mutah? Honestly, like I don't know a single guy who's done it. So whether it's a common practice, no one's told me. Is it allowed? Sayyid Sistani does not allow. Um, so if a man is married to a a Muslim woman, he's not allowed to do muta with a Christian or a Jew at that time, and he's not allowed to do muta with another Muslim woman either without the wife's permission. So I would say that it's because of those reasons, it's not a common practice at all. You know, so even it wouldn't, they would be allowed with a major conditional that the wife allows it. All right, so I think that's good. We're taking more of the academy's time, but I think that's good. Alhamdulillah. We'll end here. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته